does it mean to make music? Is it defined by the relationship between performer and listener? Between performer and their instrument? Performer and society? Or even the performer and themselves? All of these approaches certainly have merit, but today I seek to better define music making in terms of all the relationships between three specific elements, those being the performer, the form and content of what is being performed, i.e. the music itself, and finally time, particularly the present and past. To help accomplish this task, I'll be using improvisation and my personal experience with it as a point of reference. As it relates to improv, I'll be answering these three major questions. How can we define improvisation and music making more broadly using a spectral analysis? What is the relationship between common practice period or classical music and improvisation? And finally, why is improvisation beneficial for students to learn? At the end, I will take you through my own personal history with improvisation from my own unique perspective. As a classically trained musician, improvisation was always a world apart from me. It inspired both wonder and almost at the same time, a certain type of contempt or jealousy. But as I've taught myself how to improvise over the past few years, improvisation and the meaning of music making has been at least partially demystified to me. I'll share what that learning process looked like, some important things I've learned, as well as what the musical outcome has been. Coming from a classical background, I always thought that the definition of improvisation was an either-or proposition, completely black and white. Something was either improvised in the moment or not in the moment. In other words, I had a binary view of improvisation and of music making in general. Unpacking this binary understanding of music has been one of the great benefits of learning how to improvise. I've come to embrace the gray areas between black and white. For this reason, I'll be using an analytical framework that can best represent this gray area, what I call a spectral analysis. To demonstrate this form of analysis, I will first spectrally analyze form and content. Form and content is a well-established aesthetic framework for artistic analysis. In the context of music, form is the method of organization, i.e. the rhythm or division of time. The content is what is being organized, in this case pitch or sound waves, ranging from timbre to fundamental pitch to counterpoint and finally to harmony like scales and keys. It is impossible to totally separate these two things, and yet at the same time they are opposites of each other. You can't organize if there's no content to organize, and you can't have content without some framework of organization. Rather than seeing things solely in black and white, we can create a spectrum between form and content that can be interpreted in many ways, however we like. This way we can see and use the gray area between two interrelated opposites. There are many ways form and content can be interpreted as a spectrum. First of all, we have to define what is being measured. Are we measuring a particular section of the work or the entire work itself? In terms of the form, are we focusing on small-scale rhythm or large-scale structure and time signature? In terms of the content, are we focusing on the timbre, the harmony, the scales and keys, etc.? And secondly, we must define how it's being measured. Which element, form or content, is musically more dominant, which is more important, or which you hear more, or perhaps even enjoy more, which are more historically relevant. And this is the case for both listener and performer. So there are a lot of ways that the spectrum can be interpreted, but using a spectrum is still useful so long as we define these variables. The primary way I'll be interpreting the measurement is in terms of dominance. Which element is more important or perhaps more prevalent than the other? Returning to our three primary elements, those being performer, time, and the music itself, how can we use a spectral analysis to define the relationship between these elements? In terms of the relationship between time, or the past and present, and the music, or form and content, I believe we can use a spectrum of new to old. And similar to how we can interpret form and content spectrums in different meaningful ways, for a new to old spectrum, there are two important ways we can interpret this spectrum. One being, what percentage of the form and content being performed is new or old? And really, this is the spectrum between improvisation and composition. Again, these are two interrelated opposites. Whenever we compose something, there's still some element of improvisation to it. And whenever we improvise, not all of it can be entirely new content. And the second way we can interpret it is to ask, how new is new and how old is old? From seconds to minutes to hours and onward. For something to classify as improvisation, at least some of the content must be created as it's being performed, i.e. some of it must be in the seconds, minutes area of the spectrum. But not all of it, which is where our first interpretation comes into play. Reinterpreting these as non-binary was huge coming from a classical background. I used to think improv was always totally made up on the spot in its entirety. And so in terms of defining improvisation using a spectral analysis, we can say that improv is more new than old, and some aspect of the performance must be new enough that it's created or defined during the performance. The other main relationship I'd like to talk about is between the performer and the music itself, i.e. the form and content. And I believe this creates a spectrum of creation to interpretation. In other words, this is the extent to which the performer is responsible for the music being performed. It's important to note that every act of music making will be some combination of these two. We can't be totally creative because we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. And we can't be totally interpretive because every act of music making is unique in some way. Every interpretation is still somewhat creative. And so where do different types of music lie on this spectrum? Historical interpretations of classical music lie firmly in the interpretive section, ultimately reading from a score and treating it as the authoritative source is very interpretive. And I believe the outliers of classical music performance demonstrate just how interpretive it is. When we think of figures such as Vladimir Horowitz, who is known for rewriting sections of works such as Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto and Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, this is seen as being either unthinkable in modern classical performance or indicative of an underlying genius, as if only a genius could change genius music. And I believe both interpretations here are problematic. Also, when interpretations become too creative, they become too controversial. We can think of figures such as Glenn Gould, whose Bach is less controversial, but anything romantic is very different from other contemporary interpretations. That difference is often strongly disliked. We can also think of figures such as Pogorelic, who is also known for his controversial interpretations of Romantic-era music. He was famously eliminated in the third round of the International Chopin Piano Competition in 1980, which prompted Marta Argerich, a juror, to resign. Eugene Liszt, one of the jurors for the competition, said, quote, "He doesn't respect the music. He uses extremes to the point of distortion, i.e., it was too different from the written score." He was also criticized for his slow interpretations of Beethoven Opus 111. A critic said he was, quote, "desperately trying to be the Glenn Gould of Romantic pianism." These were still, with absolute certainty, interpretations, but were more creative and unique than their peers. But this was still too controversial for the classical world. So, where does improvisation lie on this spectrum? The comparison is a bit apples to oranges because we're comparing a musical style to a type of musical creation, but I want to represent the full breadth of improvisation's potential. And because of that full breadth, improv represents a wide range within this spectrum of creation to interpretation. On the one hand, it can definitely be interpretive because we can improvise over standards that are already well known, i.e. as in jazz and folk, etc. But this already is more creative than historical classical interpretation because there is new content being created by the performer within the framework of old content. On the other hand, improvisation can be as creative as music possibly can be on the entire opposite end of the spectrum. Essentially, all of the content can be created by the performer, either in the moment or beforehand at some previous time. It still can't be 100% creative or unique because no music exists in a vacuum, but the range of possibilities are certainly much wider than classical interpretation. And coming from a classical background, that difference can be staggering. So, in terms of defining improvisation using a spectral analysis, we can say that improv is more creative than interpretive. And in summary, using our spectral analysis, we can say that improvisation is music that is generally more creative than interpretive, generally more new than old, and qualitatively, some aspect of the creation process must occur as it's being played, i.e. in the present. But what about the history of improvisation as it relates to the classical repertoire? Was classical music always so firmly interpretive? One thing that was interesting for me to learn as a classically trained musician was how commonplace improvisation was in the common practice era, when all the music that contemporary classical musicians play was composed. Most of the towering giants we associate with the canon were also fluent improvisers in their day. People like Bach, Handel, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann, and Liszt. And there are all sorts of anecdotes regarding these figures and improvisation. From Beethoven humiliating a colleague by mocking their themes in an improvisation, to the famous piano duels between Handel and Scarlatti, Mozart and Clementi, and Liszt and Thalberg. There were also contemporaries who were more associated with improvisation and made it central to their entire act. People like Hummel, Loewe, Vogler, and Moscheles. Today, their compositions are not highly regarded for this reason. Composition was not their primary focus during their careers. Another interesting thing about the prevalence of improvisation in the classical era was that it was not due to any particular type of genius. Improvisation was an important skill that professional musicians would use on a daily basis. These people of the canon just happened to be extremely good improvisers. Improvisation was both part of professional music training, while also being one of the main ways that non-students who were interested in learning music could interact with it before taking lessons, such as in the case of Franz Liszt. There were also treatises on improvisation that were published, which was a way for people unaffiliated with the court to gain access to court knowledge rather than taking lessons. Both Czerny and Kalkbrenner, important historical pedagogues, published treatises on how to improvise in the mid-19th century. Later, as lessons and knowledge became more widely available, these treatises affected how people generally taught piano as well, therefore affecting the students who were taught. And there were many different forms through which improvisation was practiced throughout the common practice era. Before the advent of musical notation in the 7th century, in the Western tradition, there was much less of a difference between composition and improvisation. This development of notation and the ability to save music for later with absolute precision is what truly created the divide between composition and improvisation. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, scores were reserved typically for liturgical works, so most non-liturgical works had to have had some element of improvisation to them. Liturgical works also often had an element of vocal improvisation to them, stemming from its long history with improvisation before the creation of musical notation. In the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic eras, we have more specific techniques or forms that included some element of improvisation. We have things like embellishment and ornamentation. Scores were often seen as the starting point for a performance, and a performer was expected to perform it in their own way by adding things like stylistic ornamentation. Pieces were often judged on the basis of how good they were at facilitating this, and this was particularly the case for slow sections and movements. We also have figured bass, which was a notation system that provided the bass line and basic harmony of a piece, giving the performer the freedom to realize other complementary parts as they saw fit. This was essentially the Baroque version of chord sheets, and many of Monteverdi's early operas were primarily notated with figured bass. There's also basso ostinato, which is the singular bass line being played repeatedly with improvised material on top of it. We also have the cadenza, which are solo sections of a concerto, often written or improvised by whoever was performing the concerto. About half of Mozart's cadenzas were written out by the composer, and half were expected to be provided by the performer. After the publication of Beethoven's final piano concerto, nearly all cadenzas were provided by the composer. We also have preluding and transitional material. This was improvisatory content meant to prepare listeners for the next repertoire piece or to give the performer time to adjust to the new instrument or new key. And finally, we have the fantasia, which is a form of more free improvisation and is defined as being a piece improvised from beginning to end. Fantasias were often published as composed pieces after having been improvised. By the Romantic era, improvisers were so skilled that the audience often didn't know the difference between improvisation and pre-composed work. Musicians resorted to improvising off of melodies from the audience to prove the improvisatory nature of their performances. But around 1830 to 1870, improvisation within the classical sphere fell out of favor and usage. Going into the 20th century, musical movements like serialism and the Second Viennese School ran explicitly counter to improvisation. In Western music history, blues, jazz, rock, freestyle rap, and DJing, and many other styles, took up the mantles of both improvisation and living music. Even for styles that are not as well known for incorporating improvisation, the differences between live and recorded performances still point to popular music as the living repertoire. Live performances often string multiple pieces together in an improvisatory way that used to be part of the classical foundation, similar to preluding and transitioning. Even when improvisation is not something familiar to the recording artists themselves, music industry professionals need to be fluent in all styles and able to improvise in them. This is in addition to other basic musicianship skills such as transposition, harmonization, etc. So, in summary, we can say that improvisation has been part and parcel of Western musicianship for the majority of the West's history. Improvisation was and is an important skill for the majority of working musicians. Improvisation took many forms throughout the classical era, some of which are very similar to the forms it takes today. And popular music is the main Western sphere in which improvisation has occurred in the past 100 years, indicating it is the living repertoire. The prevalence of improvisation in Western history is itself indicative of its status as a fundamental musicianship skill, and a skill important enough for most students to learn. Pedagogically, if whole treatises were written and widely read regarding how to learn to improvise, they should point to both its historical and contemporary importance for students. And this importance is itself supported by a whole host of medical and pedagogical benefits. According to neuroscience, improvisation is a complex and holistic activity that is extremely challenging. It involves simultaneous usage of many parts of the brain, such as sections for sensory and perceptual encoding, motor control, performance monitoring, memory storage and recall, and creativity. Additionally, the state of flow is both easier to enter during and itself conducive to good improvisation. The flow state both allows for and implies decreased self-consciousness and a reduced fear of failure, conducive not only to good music making, but also a healthy relationship with music. This being in the zone can lead to higher feelings of self-efficacy, both during and after a performance. It also engages self-expression and the language communication areas of the brain. In other words, improvisation allows students to truly express themselves via music, to play what they enjoy in the most pure sense. This also indicates that the experience of improvisation is intrinsically rewarding to students. But what about the benefits of improvisation according to traditional music pedagogy? Again, it is a complex and holistic activity that allows us to teach and learn many things simultaneously. A student is at one time generating and evaluating melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic sequences. And the practice of improvisation merges music theory, ear training, composition, and performance. By focusing on more of the real-time aspects of performance, it also helps with scored performances as well. Improvisation helps students understand the relationship between the score and the actual music it represents. Learning improvisation is also shown to decrease performance anxiety for both improvisatory and non-improvisatory performances. Additionally, improvisation was found to be generally less anxiety-inducing than scored material. By providing students with more comfort communicating through music, learning improvisation can lead to greater feelings of self-efficacy regarding music, itself leading to higher motivation to learn and play music. The research makes it clear that improvisation was historically prevalent for good reason. There are many holistic and musical benefits to learning improvisation. These benefits should act as reasons why we should re-implement the teaching of improvisation more widely in the piano and music pedagogy. And finally, I'm going to take you through my own personal history with improvisation, starting in the fall of 2022. I'll lead you chronologically up to the creation of the main theme for the piece I'll be performing today. And I'll take you through various important aspects of improvisation I've discovered by teaching it to myself, such as the relationship between scales and chords, notes and rhythm, and licks and non-licks. So, this is the chord loop that I came up with initially. And in the beginning, I essentially made a chord loop for a course on popular music that I just happened to enjoy a lot, such that I constantly played it in my head and on the piano both. And part of the reasoning behind this chord loop's creation was to create a chord loop that has an unclear tonic. At some points, A minor is more dominant, such as in the beginning, and at other points, C major is more dominant. And as I continued to play it over and over again, there were more further developments. So I began to add melodic figures into the right hand. Pretty simple, just outlining different chord tones, but still a different and a development. I also added lots of added seconds to the chord progression, which I tend to enjoy. I also added a walking bass line here in measure 3. And also a B down to A. And I also added a chromatic figure in the right hand into the repeat. Right here. And so I just want to kind of briefly go over how or why this piece continued to change and develop over time. Part of it was simply curiosity and boredom. I still really enjoyed playing the same progression, but I got bored playing it the exact same way all the time. And this encouraged me to change it in some way to keep it interesting as I continued to play it. And the second reason why this continued to change and develop over time was my approach to making mistakes. Essentially, I said to myself, if a mistake sounds bad, then I should ignore the mistake. And if the mistake sounds good, then I should explore it and try to recreate it and see why it sounded so good for me to play. And one of those mistakes that actually occurred created a further development of this piece, adding sevenths to all of the chords. So I'll play what's up on the board here. And yeah, this harmony became completely different, but the older harmony was still available to me. And there are some pretty crunchy chords in this harmony, particularly the third chord is a G augmented 7th add 2. And that was definitely not intentional on my part, but ended up sounding really good, and I decided to keep it. And so the next thing that occurred is essentially what I would call the main theme here. You'll see before and after, I would say before the red line is sort of the introduction to the main theme, and after the red line is the main theme. And what I essentially did to create what I would call the main theme is by isolating notes from this new harmony, focusing on the notes that sounded the most good to me, the best to me. And particularly this was the tritone coming from C all the way down, C and F sharp or G flat. And this was really enjoyable to me, particularly from a classical perspective, with the classical history. Having a non-resolution of this tritone and the implied dominant seventh chord was especially pleasing. Dominant seventh is just another chord, right? This is how it plays or how it resolves. Typically we would expect some sort of resolution like this, which is still applicable and still useful. But having that extra option was just kind of exciting. So let me play the main theme for you. And yeah, so the next major development was the discovery and differentiation between scales and chords. And this was really eye-opening for me to realize that I could play just about any note within a particular scale over a particular chord, and it would sound good and be fun to play. And I intuitively learned which scales sound the best with which particular chords within the chord progression that I was learning. And I kind of lucked out with the chord progression in the sense that it's relative chromaticism, right? We just go chromatically down in the second chord. So that relative chromaticism allows for more available scales throughout the entire chord loop. And also the double tonic nature, kind of sidling between A minor and C major, also I think allows for a wider variety of available scales. And these are the full list of scales that I tend to use throughout the piece. I definitely don't use all 8 at all times. Usually there's a focus on 2 to 4, but I can add some of the remaining ones for a little bit of spice every once in a while. So for example, probably the most common one that I use is simply the C minor scale. But B major, is probably the most outside of the realm of C major. But it can be kind of fun every once in a while. Another thing that I kind of learned is the difference between filler and guide notes. And the advent of using scales allowed me to play what I essentially think of as filler notes that fill the space during more solo-like sections between guide notes. And guide notes are essentially chord tones of whatever chord I'm playing, or of particularly more structurally important chords. So the most important guide note that I use is E over C towards the end of the chord loop. This is simply because I'm already playing 2 C's in my left hand. I don't want to play a third C. I don't want to play G because it doesn't really imply the quality of the chord very well. So E is the go-to for me. And I use this all of the time. So I can essentially do whatever I want in terms of scalar figures in the right hand, but so long as I end on an E towards the C major chord, it sounds fine to me. And because I'm not really at a level where I can improvise chords on the spot, chord tones and chords act primarily as those guide notes between the filler notes. And the reason why I tend to use E over C a lot is because of the structural importance of C, especially coming from the tonic area of A minor. I want to emphasize how important C is. The next thing I'd like to talk about is notes and rhythm. Rhythm, I think, is definitely easier to improvise. For me, the time signature of a piece is primarily determined by the left hand for me. And there's three main time signatures that I tend to use. One is what I've been using already. Basically what I think of as half time. We can also double it for double time. That's the main theme that we heard earlier in double time. And then every once in a while, I'll do basically some sort of triple meter, either 3/4 or what's essentially 6/8. And in terms of the micro rhythm, or the small scale rhythm in the right hand, the main difference for me is between swinging and not swinging. I tend to prefer swinging for whatever reason. It just sounds better to me. But sometimes I'll not swing. And I'm also a big fan of this triplet figure. It's very fast notes, and sometimes they don't really follow a specific rhythmic element. I'm just trying to fill in literally as many notes as possible in order to get to my guide note. And that really reminds me of things like Chopin, where there's 11 tuplets essentially. You're just trying to fill in however many notes you need in order to get to that guide note. And finally, I'd like to talk about licks and non-licks, or what we would think of as repertoire in improvisation. This is essentially differentiating between material that's not entirely new and material that is new to varying degrees, different levels of newness here. So there's, for me, three main types. There's one being the home base, and in this case, this is the main theme. So after I've done something that's really improvisatory or more new, as kind of a break, I'll come back to home and play the main theme, which I've already played for you several times. There's also familiar licks and scales. There's several that are quite simple in terms of their theory. Simple repetitions like repeating F, G, and C. Which can be fun for a little bit. C, repeated note. And also F, G, C, but moving up in inversions. And also just inversions of chords can also be a way to take something that's old and make it a little bit new. And just, various ways that I've changed either the harmony or the melody of the main theme or chords. I try to keep things different as much as I can while still having a sense of regularity and repetition. And there's also things that I do that are less familiar, such as the use of the B scale that I talked about before. be outlining more flat chords that are, again, not really in the key signature very much. Or just things that I do or come up with in the moment that I can't describe. So I'd like to move on to the actual performance now, and I have a performance plan. Usually when I play this through practicing at home, the structure is literally unstructured. But for a performance like this, I have a sort of game plan that may or may not change, that is subject to change as I play through. And this is the game plan. I'm going to start with sort of some of the original theming to kind of represent the amount and extent of development that's occurred over my time working with this piece. Then we'll try it slow in 2 or in half time, then moving on to fast in 2 or in half time, then slow but with some new chords, some new melodies, again in half time, then ending with some sort of climax, fast in double time, and then finally ending. So yeah, we'll see the extent to which this literally pans out, but within the structure, I'm allowed to do essentially whatever I want. In conclusion, improv is not the work of genius, unapproachable or impossible. Instead, it is the result of effort, approachable by anyone and indicative of a living music. Improv is not entirely new, entirely creative, or entirely made up on the spot. Instead, it is primarily new, primarily creative, and has some element defined as it's being performed. Improv is not a historical anomaly with little benefit for students. Instead, its absence is a historical anomaly and has many benefits for musicians of all age and skill levels. This is what I have learned about improvisation coming from a classical background, and I still have so much more to learn. In terms of improv, things like transposition and comfort in all keys, significant ear training, and continued composition are in my future. In terms of pedagogy, how to teach someone how to improvise is a totally new field of knowledge that I'm excited to dip my toes into. But all in all, improvisation has been worth my time to learn and has made me a more well-rounded and complete working musician. I can say with absolute certainty that it is definitely worth every musician's time to learn how to improvise as well. Thank you.